What's up, y'all? In this video, I'm going to talk about how the predicted grade assistant works so that way you can use it in your classroom. Let's get to it. So we'll start by looking at here. This is going to be mostly data entry. Of course, you've got the students that you are going to enter here. You're going to use the course name and then the level that you have for your course. Now, these names here and this level here has to match up what's going on in the grade breakdowns. This column B, is all of the courses that are offered from the IB and all the levels that correspond with it. I also have the external assessments listed here, 1, 2, 3, and any internal assessments that you have. All of these values are the percentages that are weighted by IB for each component that's assessed for your particular class. If you want to change the name, so maybe you want to put on here Spanish ab inicio, that's fine. Just as long as this, whatever you have typed right here, matches exactly what is put right here. So those two things have to be the same in order for the calculations to work. Similarly, you need to have an associated HL or SL. Now, if you don't want to look at that all the time, you can always hide these two columns. It's not going to impact anything if you hide those columns if you'd like. It's not going to impact the calculations at all. Then we have a few different things here. We've got the assessment name. This is just for your own tracking purposes. This is the date that I had it on. And here I have got a drop down of different options for my types of assessment that I might give. None of these three things right here, the assessment name, the date, or the type of assessment, are going to matter for the actual calculation purposes of your predicted grades. The thing that is going to matter is up here. These are the components that your assessment mirrors. Now, what I recommend is that anything that you put in here should be a major assessment, not quizzes, not formative assessments, but a major assessment, and it should follow a similar format for how IB assesses, so that way you get a better idea of how the student is going to perform on that particular component. If you don't like P1 or P2, if you want to name it something else, maybe you've got another thing. It's like you're a language teacher and you're doing oral or listening, and you'd rather have that than paper 1 or paper 2, you can go over here to what I call the helper column. So I'm going to scroll all the way over past all of this stuff. We'll get to that stuff in a second. And here you have the helper columns. So these are hidden, but if you just click on that arrow, you'll see these are all the behind the scenes calculations of things that are being done to help you get the values that we'll get to in a second. Up along the top here, this is where you can name your different components. So I use P1 because it's short and abbreviated. You could put paper 1, you could put reading, you could put anything in there. But this is corresponding to the specific percentage that goes with what you're considered paper 1 in the IB. So even if you change the name, know that this first one here is going to always associate with paper 1. This paper 2 here, that will correspond with whatever the percentage is for paper 2, paper 3, and so on. Below that, you've got the different assessment types. These are not impacted in your calculations whatsoever. So you can call those things whatever you want. It's not going to change anything. But this thing is going to be important because these are corresponding to specific calculations. So you do want to make sure that you keep them tracked with paper 1 going to paper 1, paper 2 going to paper 2, and so on. Then you'll see that I've got all of the scores listed in here. Now, we know that IB only marks from 1 to 7, but in order to determine if you are a low, a medium, or high within that mark band, I've allotted for some decimals in here. So if you see a 4 or a 5, that means a low 4 or 5. If you see a 0.5 in here, so 4.5 or 6.5, that means you're in middle of the band. And if you see a high marking of a 0.8, here we've got a couple at 4.8. That means they're at the upper edge of the 4 mark band, but they haven't quite gotten into 5 yet. It actually took me a while to realize that if I just used a 4, a 5, a 6, or a 7, that I wasn't taking into consideration how deep or how high they were into that mark band. And that's going to be really important. So while it might seem odd to have a score of a 7.8, a 7.8, that could mean something that they're almost a perfect paper. So you want to award that to say that they've really mastered this one particular topic. So then you've got 30 columns across here to enter data. I figure 30 assessments is pretty ample for a 2-year course for major assessments. If you need to go over 30, email me. That information is here on the instructions tab, where you can see down at the bottom, there's some spaces where you can email me. Here, send help, send an email to help, and I can take care of that for you. One other thing that I do want to note is that with your components that you're using, maybe you mix paper 1 and paper 2 type exams together. You can choose more than one component for an exam. But what that will do is take that 4.5 for this particular student, and it will put it in both the paper 2 and the paper 1 computations. So that will be counted twice in 2 separate places. So you may want to be cautious if you do that. Now let's get to the good stuff. Over here, as we scroll over past these 30 columns of data entry, we see first that we have a mode calculation. Now the mode is simply the most frequently occurring score. And so here for Derek Thomas, paper 1, he had 4 happen the most frequently for all the paper 1 assessments. Paper 2, 3, and the IA, he doesn't have anything that's recurring more frequently than another, so there is no mode for that. Whereas Taylor Swift down here, she's got a 6 and a 7, so that means maybe there's 5 assessments in there. 2 of them she scored a 6s on, 2 of them she scored 7s on, and 1 of them she scored a 5 on. So that's going to show that there's a 6 and a 7 for 2 modes. I kind of use the mode as a tie break. So that way, if I'm on the edge between 2 grades, I might use the mode to help me bump up or go down one way or the other. Next come the averages. Averages are just that. Average of all the paper 1 scores, average of all the paper 2 scores, and so on. Then they are weighted to create a weighted average. That means for this course, analysis and approaches, for HL, that's going to do 30% for this, 30% for this, 20% for this, 20% for that, added together to come up with this weighted average. Then the low or the middle or the high is based on this grading breakdown over here. Anything up to 0.4 will be considered low, 0.4 to 0.7 will be considered mid, and 0.7 up will be considered high. So that's how you can kind of get whether you are at a low, a medium, or a high score here. So why is my predicted average, my predicted grades red? Well, none of these are actually showing as red at this moment. But if you saw this thing highlighted red, that would mean either you did not have an IA score, maybe it's early in the semester and you haven't worked on the IA, or you haven't done your paper 3 yet if you're HL or whatever course requires paper 3s. So what happens then is the default for the average is going to be a 5. I'm just going to assume that they're a 5, and that's going to be calculated in there. So it's a little warning. This will pop up red if there is that warning that, hey, a default is being used for either paper 3 or the IA because we're missing those scores. Then there is what's called the trends. The trends are kind of like a scatter plot. If you've ever seen it, you've seen scatter plots before where you've got data going up in one direction. And that's going to show what the trend line is for that particular data. So the trend for paper 1, paper 2, paper 3, and the IAs. And then again, those are weighted and given a strength. Now, these are all done based on what's called a linear regression. There's a little bit of a detail on that in the instructions, but basically that's a good way to determine a straight line that goes with that data, whether it's going up or going down. And then the trust in the trend is using what's called the coefficient of determination. You know, I'm a math teacher. I've got to be mathy about this. And it's basically, in layman's terms, it's how well do you trust the calculations? So I've averaged out all of the different coefficient of determinations for each of these things. And it says you can trust this calculation about 50% of the time. So, you know, use that with a grain of salt, but then we've got some up here that are in the 70s. So that might be a little bit more trusting. So, and also what that means is if the data is lining up more accurately, you're going to have a higher trust in the calculation. If the data is scattered all over the place, then it's going to be a lower trust in that. So if they're consistently scoring the same values or consistently going up, you're going to see that trust percentage is getting bigger. This also has the same message that pops up for if you've got a red score in here, where it's going to default to a 5. Then the last thing we have is I've got 3 columns here to put in different predicted grades. So at my schools, I've always had 3 predicteds that I had to give. Usually one is at the end of year 1. That would be my first predicted grade, and I can put a date in there to say, here's where it is, where I cut it off. So when I'm looking at my data set, I can see that. Paper 2 is usually for all the early admissions people, maybe the regular admissions as well. That would be cut off 2. And then cutoff 3 or predicted 3 would be what I send to IB. So I'm able to track it over time and able to see how they're progressing in their scores over that time as well. So that's how the predicted grade assistant works, what I sometimes call the PGA. And hopefully this will help you have a more data-informed method for calculating your students' predicted grades. I'll talk to you later.